In 1949, the Chinese Civil War came to an end, and it was the communists defeating the nationalists. And the nationalists fled to Taiwan, set up the Republic of China, whereas Mao and the communists went to Beijing and set up the People's Republic of China. This came on the heels of really what was supposed to be the end of China's century of humiliation, after the Europeans had brought China to its knees, semi-colonization of China, establishing spheres of influence. Then we have the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, that period of disunity until 1927. And then the Civil War ensues full strength along with the Japanese invasion in the 1930s. And then eventually you have Mao take control of the Communist Party during the Long March, or not just during the Long March, but using the Long March to solidify control and promoting his notion of the mass line theory all the way through those thousands of miles, while they lost tens of thousands of communists along the way. And anyway, in 1949, you have Mao stand in Tiananmen Square and say China has stood up. And he would rule the country very badly for the next 27 years. The tenets of Maoism that we need to have you be aware of: collectivism. We referenced it quite a bit in the Russian unit as well, with the collectivization of agriculture and that collectivist mindset. Similarities with Stalin there, where you have the execution, in Mao's case, of probably 1 million to 2 million landlords. Struggle and activism, and that means, you know, the internal struggle to be a better Maoist, Marxist-Leninist Maoist thought, and the activism to be a proper party member and support Mao's goings-on and doings. Mao did believe in that mass line theory, where he said we need constant contact between the party and the people for correct party leadership. And focus on egalitarianism, so theoretically collective equality, always a goal of Mao. And Mao also believed in self-reliance, that autarky from a phraseology or terminology standpoint, where they would kind of shun globalization and attempt to do it on their own. 1956 brought us the moment when Mao, after 7 years in power, asked for criticism and asked for people's opinions on the party, and he said, let's let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend. He got blistered by criticism. He responded very harshly in 1957 with the anti-rightist campaign of 57, and we get into these series now of mass campaigns under Mao. One of the very worst, of course, being the Great Leap Forward, that horribly failed policy ending in the deaths of 30 million people. This was the attempt at rapid industrialization, major use of communes to try to develop agriculture. Mao wanted to move 20 years in a day. He wished to pass the U.S. and Europe. They mobilized the masses again in big ways, built backyard furnaces for the melting of metal implements, and like the big communes in the agricultural sector. The focus was on the unanimity from a political standpoint, the zeal to be the best Marxist-Leninist Maoist that you could be. And remember, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. Mao's biggest contribution to that was the role of the peasantry in building revolution, and so it was always that focus on the peasantry. And in this case, like I said, unfortunately, 30 million people dead. Mao responded to this very ideologically in the 1960s with the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution. This was the 10 years of political chaos in China. Ultimately, it was Mao trying to ideologically purify the party, get rid of the pragmatist or the moderate or the expert element, if you will, in all those factions that we talked about. Mao unleashed the Red Guards, those youth groups who were charged with attacking authority and bombarding the command post. Wanted to get rid and destroy of old and Western traditions. Get rid of intellectuals and send them down for re-education. So remember that re-education piece was sending people down to the countryside for hard labor, and of their bourgeoisie traits. You also very possibly could get sent down to re-education if you were labeled a capitalist voter, someone who was advocating for the free market. And do recall that Deng Xiaoping very much got sent down twice during the Cultural Revolution for re-education due to his two pragmatic traits with the black cat, white cat, and so forth. The Little Red Book was used to shore up ideological strength for the Maoism at the time, and it was in fact the massive cult of personality that was built up during this time, and some awful stuff, in a lot of cases driven by the very radical group, the Gang of Four. Cultural Revolution didn't truly phase out until Mao died in 1976. There we see the remnants of the Cultural Revolution, like I said, the burning of the olds, the dragging people through the streets, the self-criticism sessions. And then Deng Xiaoping came in, and in 1978 he consolidated power by embracing the four modernizations, and Deng said, we're going to promote the economy. The party will still be in charge. They will manage modernization very carefully, and that China would stop being so ideological. They would use pragmatism, and they would start to focus on the use of technocrats rather than revolutionary era politicians. These are the four modernizations that Zhou Enlai had introduced in 1973. Deng dragged them back out in 78 and said these are the four areas in which we are going to focus on as a means by which to modernize society, be pragmatic economically, pour a bunch of money into, and be creative. And it was this year, 1978, the year in which China began its reform and opening, and the party began its embrace of what came to be known as socialism with Chinese characteristics. The big evolution of the economy in the People's Republic after 1949, Maoism's focus of collectivism eventually giving way to Deng's economic reforms, the use of township and village enterprises that decentralized economic decision-making with local party officials and local business people, the household responsibility system, economic liberalization in the agricultural sector, where you had farmers given the incentive to grow more of their crops for a surplus, and then they could sell that surplus for profit. It was very successful and expanded to other sectors of the Chinese economy. And special economic zones, which we have referenced a fair amount. Remember, those were the initial 5 on the southeastern coast, where Deng said essentially we're going to flirt with capitalism and establish laboratories of capitalism, foreign investment, private property allowed, private profit allowed, and tax breaks and so on. And they exploded with success. And then that style of economic development expanded up the coast into these other economic and technical development zones and so forth. And the incredible success of the Chinese economy over the last 40 years has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, although the negative effects, of environmental degradation, increased social class cleavages, and so on. Inland coastal cleavage also exacerbated as a result of this one. And the Pudong in Shanghai is always the poster child for this. 1992, it was declared a technical development zone, economic and technical development zone, and 20 years later, we have that blistering development. All of this economic model of China now, it's not full-on free market. It's not straight-up neoliberalism, and it's all too easy for you to think like that. It's not. It's state capitalism, and it has become even more state-directed under the leadership of Xi Jinping. Yes, it's the free market elements, and it's also the state managing things and maintaining a lot of state-owned enterprises, and the state keeps its hands on the economy with freedom given to it. So the Beijing Consensus is the term for it, and that is a challenger to the traditional notions of the Washington Consensus that has really been the governing idea economically ever since Bretton Woods, decades and decades ago. With economic liberalization came requests for political liberalization, and that has not happened in China. To an amazing degree, it has not happened in China. You did have Wei Jingsheng, the author of The Fifth Modernization, that essay asking for more democracy, arrested in 1978-79, given over a decade in prison for inciting subversion of state power. The Tiananmen Square uprising crushed in 1989 when you had students demanding more political rights under Deng Xiaoping, putting up the goddess of democracy, and subsequently feeling the wrath of the party state on June 4th of 1989. There's what Ai Weiwei thinks of that. And so if Mao was the first generation leader, Deng second generation leader, then you had Jiang Zemin as the third generation leader. And the two biggies we talked about with Jiang were his the admission that there were business people in the party and that they could do that in a non-controversial way. That was the three represents, the formal inclusion of business people in the party, and then his banning of the Falun Gong, the meditation group, exercise group that got to be such a big civil society threat in the party's eyes. So banned in 1999, there they are. The party does not like large-scale gatherings of people like that, particularly when they're all hewing to one particular thing. Hu and Wen, fourth generation, harmonious society and scientific development. Hu was very conservative, and Wen was a bit more of the person here that was the face of this party state during the fourth generation. Hu was conservative, bland, and not a lot of innovation during his time. And so they preached sustainability, they preached increased social welfare, a more person-based society, limited expansion of individual freedoms, and that creation of the harmonious society. And it was during Hu and Wen's tenure that we had that tumultuous year of 2008. So many good things in here you can pull out for a free response question if you get asked about various aspects of the Chinese and how they've gone about things in the last decade or so. The Tibetan riots in March of 2008, remember this is the year of the Olympics now, and the March of 2008 Tibetan uprising in response to the political and religious controls placed upon the Tibetan people, the constant squashing of Tibetan advocacy for more autonomy, because the Chinese always fearing Tibet is advocating for more sovereignty, and the infusion of Han out to Tibet and more economic opportunities for the Han led to that uprising in 2008, the crackdown and the public sympathy globally for sure for the Tibetan people. Sichuan earthquake of 2008, we talked about the collective grief the nation felt. We talked about how the earthquake killed upwards of 85,000 people, many of whom were school kids whose schools pancaked on them after not having been built up to code. That's when the propaganda department said to the reporters, stop asking questions. And it is when Ai Weiwei became more of a pain in the neck to the Communist Party with the art display of the list of kids who had died in it, along with their birthdays and the date of death. Increased nationalism continued now, so lots of nationalism as a result of the Tibetan protest, more nationalism because of the earthquake, and now intense nationalism in the summer of 2008 because of the Olympic torch protests in China, or excuse me, especially in Europe, but the nationalism in China, of course. The tainted milk scandal didn't come to be public until after the Olympic Games. Remember, we said that the party found out about it earlier, but that lack of transparency and lack of regulation led to the deaths of any number of infants, the hospitalization of tens of thousands with the tainted milk scandal, and then the execution of Sanlu executives shortly thereafter. The Olympics themselves went off with great fanfare and with great success for the Chinese, lots more nationalism. And the games played to great success internationally, impressing the world with the scope of them. And the year ends on the note of Charter 08, and that is the online petition that the Communist Party sought to squelch. And the author Liu Xiaobo, one of the prominent people responsible for authoring this document that had been circulated, thousands of signatures, asking for the types of things you see on the screen. Liu Xiaobo is arrested and imprisoned for subversion of state power, subsequently given the Nobel Peace Prize by the Nobel Committee, and while he was in jail, given the prize And then, as we mentioned in class, Liu Xiaobo dying of cancer in the summer of 2017, the first Nobel laureate to die in custody of the state since the Nazi era. So that's again, I say in class, who are the cousins here? And Wei Jingsheng, 1978, he's the cousin of Liu Xiaobo from a democratization attempt standpoint. And the fifth modernization is the SA cousin, if you will, of Charter 08. So be able to connect those things and also connect the principle of political liberalization not happening in China. So again, economic liberalization without political liberalization. Chen Guangcheng, a dissident, so we throw in a few more people here as we close out this section of the AP review session. The blind human rights lawyer that ran afoul of the authorities because of his success in defending women violated by the one-child policy, eventually thrown in jail for 4 years, then house arrest, and then escape, and you do recall that story. Ai Weiwei, dissident artist who has been harassed by the party, held incommunicado, had his passport taken away, harassed on all fronts, told to stay off social media. Of course, he did not adhere to that. He tried to investigate the earthquake deaths of all the kids and look into the tofu construction. Ai Weiwei finally given his passport back and is now outside of China. Su Zhiyang was the leader of that New Citizens movement, which advocated more reform in the Chinese system, and the group got to be a bit too big for the Communist Party's liking. So Su Zhiyang spent 4 years in jail as a result of that. And then the leadership transition case in 2012. Remember that Bo Xilai, the big rock star in the party, the party chief of Chongqing, and ticketed for the Politburo Standing Committee, already on the Politburo. His wife arrested for the murder of British businessman Neil Heywood, and the Communist Party could not have that leadership transition issue, so Bo was arrested, charged with corruption, and both he and his wife now in prison for the duration of their lives.